Week 4 is in the books. There are a ton of bye weeks coming up and even more injuries that we have to fill. So let's go ahead and dominate the waiver wire. And make sure to stick around to the end of this video because I'll be giving you guys a list of defenses that are guaranteed to put up 20 plus points. And as we get into it, here's a quick list of players that are rostered in over 50% of leagues but should definitely be added as your first priority. Make sure they're not out there on your waivers. It's always good to double check your bases there. And go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you do enjoy this video. We have our like goal right here. It would mean a ton to me. But I don't like wasting people's time. The number one question everybody's asking is, what are we going to do? Rashee Rice, ACL torn, out for the season. Who are we going to pick up for him? And my answer to that, obviously outside of Xavier Worthy that we can't pick up, is going to be Juju, because he has the closest play style to Rashee Rice. We've seen in this offense before when there's no wide receivers before Rashee Rice started his breakout. The good news is that with Isaiah Pacheco out, it's forced the Chiefs to be a lot more pass heavy. Their passing percentage has gone up to 60% of their plays, which is a huge bump than their regular numbers in the beginning of the year. But the Sky Moores and the Justin Watsons probably aren't going to have a big enough role to actually be fantasy viable. Juju would be my number one option. You can go pick him up as a safety valve, but I don't think he's going to be anything startable in the near future yet. But a guy that is Dontayvion Wicks. This guy's only rostered in 13% of leagues, and now we have Christian Watson possibly suffering with a high ankle sprain. If we know anything about those injuries, they are pretty ticky-tacky and they can last longer than expected. And we were saying Christian Watson, this is a guy that was the nightmare to draft earlier in the pre-draft process, and now obviously there's the injury, but this puts Dontayvion Wicks completely in the offense. We saw after Watson left the game, leading the team in targets, ran 80% of the routes, led the team with a 24% team target share and 35% air yard share. And all those numbers mean is that he was trusted and he was open. And if you look at the numbers, you can see that he had 13 targets, only 5 catches, 78 yards, 2 touchdowns. A very good game. We have Jordan Love back in this offense, so the passing numbers are going to get to where they should be again. Now, he didn't have a great game, but they get a bounce back matchup in week 5 against the Cardinals, who are allowing top 5 points to literally everybody, wide receivers, tight ends, quarterbacks, and they just let the Commanders put up 42 points on them. For context, Jaden Reed is my number one wide receiver out of this offense now. He's probably not going to be on your waivers though. Dontayvion Wicks and Romeo Doubs are going to be about tied for that number 2 spot. But Xavier Legette, I'm sure you've expected to be in this video, is a guy we need to go pick up because this Panthers offense has looked completely different with Andy Dalton. They're averaging 20 points a game and 2 passing touchdowns a game from Andy Dalton with 200 plus yards. And all that led Legette to have 10 targets for 6 receptions, 66 yards and a touchdown, his first of his career. And what's good about this addition for Legette is that Adam Thielen is on IR. The earliest he's possibly going to come back is week 8, and I really think it's going to be a good amount longer than that. And the Panthers defense is absolutely terrible. And we know if you have a bad defense, you're going to have to keep the passing volume up because you want to control the pace of games, because the Panthers have allowed 32 points a game on average. Dontayvion Johnson is easily the wide receiver 1 here, but from what we've seen, there's more than enough room for a viable number 2 wide receiver. With the projected pass numbers we're going to continue to see. Rest in peace, Bryce Young, though. But if you need another wide receiver, let's say you can't get those guys, Wandale Robinson should be atop your list of waiver ads. And this is a guy I've always believed in the talent for. He just hasn't had the health. He's been in and out with injury, and the team just hasn't been the greatest. But now they have Malik Neighbors that really opens up this offense, and he gets to absolutely eat in that short to intermediate game, getting a ton of targets. He's had almost 40 targets in 4 weeks and just came off 14 last week. But with all that being said, there definitely is a possibility that Malik Neighbors is not good to go. In week 5, he was dealing with a concussion. Luckily, that happened on Thursday, so he has a longer week to come back. I really don't think that's going to affect him because if he's gone, Wandale's the wide receiver 1. If he's there, it just adds layers to this offense, and Wandale can get more usage because the offense is actually moving. But I'm going to keep preaching this. If you don't have Josh Downs and he is still on your waiver wire, please go and make a claim. He's only rostered in 25% of leagues collectively on ESPN, Yahoo, Sleeper, and everything combined. And the game he just had should completely wake up the fantasy managers. I'm telling you, there's not that much opportunity left to go pick him up. We have Joe Flacco in this offense. Some could say that's better for the passing volume and the wide receivers. I'll leave that up to your own interpretation, even though I do kind of believe so. But last week led Josh Downs to 9 targets, 8 receptions, 82 yards, and a touchdown. Again, he's only playing 50% of the snaps. He played 51% last week. These are not his final numbers. If he's getting 9 targets and 5 targets in the last 2 weeks where he's only playing 50% of the snaps, you gotta understand, as he improves, as he comes back from a pretty major injury, he's going to get more snaps and more opportunities with Joe Flacco opening up this pass offense. Jonathan Taylor is also questionable. If there is any outside chance that he happens to miss this week's matchup against the Jaguars, you got to believe they're going to lean even more on the pass game because there's really nobody else outside of JT that's capable of taking a lot of rushing attempts from this offense. The Jaguars are a very bad defense as far as allowing fantasy points. They are top 10 to wide receivers, quarterbacks. But speaking of running backs and good matchups, we need Tank Bigsby to be on our roster. He's not rostered in a ton of leagues. He's still out there for 90% of people. Last week, for some reason or other, Travis Etienne did not start this game. He took a big shot in the first quarter. something to do with his shoulder potentially. It wasn't anything serious, but he was on the sideline with his helmet off for a good amount of that first half of the game. And ETN isn't at risk of missing this week or really any more time for that issue. But it did show that in his absence, Tank Bigsby can absolutely be serviceable. He had 7 rushing attempts for 90 yards, 13 yards per carry. A lot of that came from one big run. But outside of that, if you take it out, he was still averaging over 5 yards per carry and very, very efficient. And this isn't just a fluke game. Even though Travis Etienne was sidelined for a bit in the beginning, in week 1, Bigsby had 12 touches. Then in week 2, he got injured. Week 3, he was still working back from that. And then in week 4, he did what he just did here, which was 7 carries on 30% of the snaps. Now, that's not amazing numbers. 30% isn't crazy, but you still have Travis Etienne, a really good RB1. He's not going to have a whole ton of startable value with Etienne healthy. It's another one of those handcuff situations, though, and he does get a great matchup this week against the Indianapolis Colts, who are allowing some of the most points to wide receivers and running backs. And speaking of backups, Roschon Johnson is another guy you want to keep in the back of your head, especially with all these bye weeks coming up. Last week, he saw 7 rushing attempts for 26 yards and a touchdown. It was against a Rams terrible defense, though, and we saw that with Swift, by far his best game of the year. 16 rushing attempts, 93 yards and a touchdown, 5.8 yards per carry. Very efficient for him. Both of these running backs did really good in what they were given, and it looks like the coaching staff has learned to throw the check down. If you guys have been around these videos for long enough, you remember in week 1 I was saying they need to learn how to throw the check down. It's really going to help open up this offense. Well, we saw DeAndre Swift get 7 receptions and 70 yards out of the backfield, so it looks like they listened. But with all of that being understood, DeAndre Swift is still going to operate as this team's RB1. I don't expect Roschon to come out and take his role for that. But the coaching staff has come out and said that Roschon has earned and he will get a role in the red zone, which is what we've been seeing for the past 2 weeks, and that's kind of scary. DeAndre Swift isn't the best red zone back. He got tackled, I think, over 10 times inside the 5 last year with Eagles. He had a very bad touchdown rate. When you get intel from coaches like that, it's usually a good sign. I wouldn't say Roschon is startable next to DeAndre Swift until he gets injured. But with that being said, this offense is looking better, and their comparative snap share from last week wasn't insanely different. He's not necessarily going to be my highest priority of waiver ads. But speaking of that high priority, Justin Fields is probably going to be that number 1 guy for you if you need a quarterback. He has proven to be a great option. He's only rostered in 32% of leagues, but he went 22 for 34 passing for 312 yards and a touchdown on top of 2 rushing touchdowns and a bunch of rushing attempts and yards. He's only getting better as a passer. It looks like he's found himself in this Steelers offense despite them losing last week. And we know rushing upside for quarterbacks really heightens that floor. And to be fair, the Colts defense, again, isn't the best. They allow a good amount of points to fantasy everything's. But he had 20 points in week 3 against the tougher Chargers defense. I don't think this is really a fluke. We saw it last year with the Bears. His rushing upside is going to keep him viable. It's just if the passing can keep up with that. And it looks like he would be able to do that this year. Now coming into week 5, he gets a matchup against the Cowboys, who are allowing the 14th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. They're definitely not negative. They're definitely not the easiest matchup, though. But bringing it back to some running backs we need to keep our eyes on. Everybody loves these guys, and unfortunately they tend to get injured the most. So it should be your number 1 priority if you need it. It's going to be Kareem Hunt. And after Carson Steele fumbled, he barely saw the field. He had 1 carry after that fumble, which led Kareem Hunt to what he saw last week. 14 carries, 69 yards, 4.9 yards per carry, was very efficient, saw 45% of the snaps in his very first game back. Kareem Hunt was instantly in the RB1 role next to Samaje Perine. Now, he did take a goal line attempt that turned into a touchdown. Hunt still saw some, and he was still the RB1 in every other aspect. And despite being in and out of the league for a while, he's only 29 years old. Like, he's not 30 plus. It's still relatively old for a running back, but it's not old enough to where, like, he actually can't be viable anymore. We just have to understand that this backfield is going to be a 3 RB committee. They're going to have great weeks. There's also going to be really, really low weeks. If you're in a deeper league or you just really need a running back, Kareem Hunt, he's a pretty decent option. But as promised, my favorite part of these waiver ad videos is the defenses. My number 1 defense for this week is going to be the Denver Broncos. Go ahead and check if they're out there for you. Patrick Surtain at this point has been the best corner in the entire NFL. He's held every single wide receiver 1 to under 10 fantasy points so far this year. He's averaging 6 or 7 fantasy points given to wide receiver 1s. That's insane. And it's not just random wide receiver 1s that aren't good. It's Mike Evans, it's George Pickens, it's DK Metcalf, it's Garrett Wilson from last week. And on top of that, they've had 12 sacks in the last 2 weeks. So their defensive front is also a positive. They get to host the Raiders this week, who have not been a good offense or really a good defense either. I have them projected for 9 fantasy points. If for some reason Devontae Adams is out again for this matchup, bump that number up even more. But if you can go ahead and get them, I would place a waiver ad on the Packers defense as well. They might be allowing a ton of points to opposing offenses, but they also get a ton of takeaways. They're averaging 2 sacks and an interception a game, and they lead the NFL in turnovers forced. Now they get a matchup against the Rams, who have no Puka, who have no Cooper Kupp. Their offensive line is dealing with a whole bunch of injuries. I have them projected for 8.1 fantasy points. They are another great option with good upside. And an option that is rostered in a bit more percentage of leagues, but are another great option, get them if you can, is the Seattle Seahawks. 36% rostered, but they get a great matchup here against the Giants. Again, we have the potential for Malik Neighbors to miss this week with a concussion. If that does happen, they're going to be an even better defense. I have them projected for 9 fantasy points as well. They've averaged almost 10.5 fantasy points through the first 4 weeks of the year. They're also averaging 3.5 sacks and 1.5 forced fumbles a game. It's a great spot for them. Go ahead and pick them up. But I appreciate you guys watching this video. Make sure to come back tomorrow for the waiver wire do not add video of the traps we do not want to be picking up.